Why is ZK so interesting? Because it gives us a way that you can do verifiable compute where you run the computation once or a small number of times. You create a proof. You write that proof to a ledger, and then that ledger is a universal ledger and settlement system for all of that compute.
Hi.
Hey.
How are you, Yago? Thank you so much for coming.
Well, I mean, you invited me, and I'm not going to pass up an opportunity to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. Yeah, no, I'm super excited for our chat today. As you know, this podcast covers sort of all things Bitcoin L2, programmability, Bitcoin tech, ordinals, Bitcoin season 2, blah, blah, blah. All of the things. But most of the folks that I've had on the podcast, even though many of them are very sort of knowledgeable and expert in their field, are not necessarily people who have been in Bitcoin as long as you, and have definitely not been covering programmable Bitcoin as long as you, right? I mean, there is sort of a history to this beyond kind of the post-ordinals world that I think I've mostly been focused on with this show. So I'm excited to chat about that. For folks who don't know you, you are the founder of BitcoinOS, which is kind of one of the, I would say, like hot L2s on the market right now.
I think strictly speaking, it's not an L2, but...
Oh, well, it depends, right.
Yeah.
Which we'll get into. That's my favorite question is what's the definition of an L2? But I think actually you're probably right. BitcoinOS is pretty unique in that you guys are not focused on building an execution environment on top of Bitcoin.
No.
Is that fair? Okay. Yeah. So L2 technology, maybe a better word.
Yeah, it's like, well, we could figure out, but basically programmable Bitcoin.
We'll get into it. Yeah, we'll dive deep into that. Okay, so let's start with chatting a little bit about you, because again, you've been in this space a long time, and I think have like a unique perspective on how this tech has evolved over time. How did you get into Bitcoin? Let's just like start there.
By mistake. I was at Carnegie Mellon. I was working on machine learning. So my background is computational neuroscience, and I was working on AI and machine learning before it was cool, kind of.
Long time ago, AI.
Yeah.
This was when, like 2014 or something?
2011.
2011 AI.
Yeah, and so I was reading a whole bunch of papers in network science, and I read the wrong one by mistake. And by the time I had finished reading the Satoshi white paper...
That was the wrong one? That you accidentally read the white paper by accident?
Yeah. I had spilled coffee all over my laptop. I was so excited I was shaking. And I wrote an email, basically my first and only spam email. I wrote it to everyone I knew. And I said, you have to pay attention to this. This is going to be the future. And then I said, one day the market cap will be $1 billion.
Wow. Wow. This was in 2011. I mean, I don't even know what Bitcoin was trading at. It was probably like $1.
I mean, when I first got into it, it was probably around $3.50, something like that.
That's wild. Yeah. Okay. So a $70 million market cap essentially at that point, maybe less.
Yeah, less because there were far fewer Bitcoins.
Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. So you've accidentally fallen to the white paper. What about it drew you in? I mean, what was so exciting to you about it?
I think two things. First of all, I'd spent a lot of time being very frustrated at the internet. So I'm what most people would probably call a libertarian.
Way before Bitcoin. This was going to be another question I asked you. You were a libertarian first, before Bitcoin.
Yes, I would describe it as an agorist.
Okay, which is what for listening?
Which is the belief that the market is a better solution for most coordination problems, and basically social problems are coordination problems, than sort of top-down hierarchy.
Makes sense.
And so my belief was that what drives freedom and prosperity and innovation is property rights.
Totally. I'm with you.
And I looked at the internet. At the time, the internet felt like we had this 21st century technology, and we had married it to the political and cultural sophistication of 3000 BC, right? So instead of, in the time of the pharaohs controlled everything. They controlled there was no such thing as private property. Everything belonged to the pharaohs. And so instead of us, handing over the entire flow of the Nile and all of what it produced to the pharaoh, we had handed over the entire flow of information and all it produced to a small number of pharaohs.
Like Amazon and like just like
mostly I hate Zuck, but yeah, basically.
Okay.
And what really struck me about the white paper was that, in my reading, it was property rights for the internet. It was digital property rights. And that was mind-blowing because it was the second shoe to drop. It meant that finally the internet could become this global, productive sort of alternate economy, a great agora, a great marketplace, which would connect everyone in the world. And, they say, the whole thing about the internet was information wants to be free. Well, people want to be free. And the way you free people is you connect them without intermediaries and allow them to transact with each other. And so that was Bitcoin. But the other thing, which I think I had a bit of an unfair advantage over other people, is I grew up in South Africa during apartheid. And my family, they were definitely not like me in terms of political leanings. They were very left-wing. But they were like me in terms of being aggressively opinionated and activist. And they joined, but my older generations had joined the ANC, the African National Congress, which was Mandela's, today we call it political party, at the time was considered a terrorist organization. And so part of my family had been forced to flee South Africa. And between the ages of 9 and 11, my mother was converting our money and their money into these gold coins called Krugerrands, sewing that into my clothing and sending me overseas. So I spent some early years, sort of my pre-teens, being a gold smuggler.
Oh my God. Would have been much easier if you had a ledger.
Exactly. And that was like, I was like, wow. And the reason I thought the market cap would go to $1 billion was because I thought that the first sort of use case would be drug cartels.
Well, many people thought that, right?
Yeah.
And it is somewhat kind of a little bit.
Well, I mean, the first big use case was
black market.
Road.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So you're not too far off, but we've evolved since then. Yeah. Okay.
So, I just thought it was inevitable sort of that kind of thing was going to be extremely valuable to enough people that it would drive the growth of it would make it valuable to other people.
So did you just drop everything and basically be like, this is my life now, I'm getting into Bitcoin?
Not immediately, but over the next few months, I basically dropped everything. And I ended up moving to San Francisco and joining a games company. And the reason I joined a games company was because I had this theory that, like, I actually very quickly became very protective of Bitcoin. And I had the feeling that the world was going to try and destroy this, especially governments. And my sense was that we have to do two things in order to protect Bitcoin. One is we need to massively popularize it. And two, we need to create like a circular economy, right? We need to make it possible to transact and basically allow you to take your financial life off grid. And the way I thought you would be able to popularize digital property was through gaming. That seemed to me like the environment where it was obvious that like the world was digital to begin with. And so my theory was that would be the first sort of legit use case. And so I went to San Francisco. I joined Zynga pre-IPO, was one of the early employees there, helped turn Zynga into one of the first companies to accept BTC as a payments mechanism. Orange pulled a bunch of people and then got a lot of mud on my face because literally no one was using BTC to buy anything from Zynga.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So it turns out people don't want to spend their Bitcoin.
That's right.
Was that the takeaway there?
That was a big learning.
Yeah. Yeah. Many such cases, I feel.
Yeah.
Okay. So then what happened from there? So then how did you, what was sort of the next
I was involved in a whole bunch of things. I helped set up a sort of lobbying group, self-regulatory organization called DATA, the Digital Asset Transfer Authority.
Okay.
We figured we need to create something that sounds very serious so that we could have a seat at the table. And so, early members of that was BitPay, Kraken, Coinbase.
And what was their goal? Like, what was the
Our goal was to create the veneer of being of self-regulating ourselves, so that the regulators wouldn't try to regulate that. Yeah.
When was this?
This was 2012, 13. We started that.
So still pretty early.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I just kind of got to know the community and I was involved. And then in 2013, I started BXIL.
Okay.
BXIL was a payments company which helped exchanges and OTC desks. But basically what we did is we set up a bunch of bank accounts and then we connected to these companies who couldn't get bank accounts and we acted as their back office.
Mm.
So that was sort of a way to route around the banks. And then that business basically died with Mt. Gox because all of them had BTC in Mt. Gox and Mt. Gox took all of their BTC.
Mt. Gox was a bummer.
Mt. Gox is a bummer. I actually was trying to short. I learned a really big lesson with Mt. Gox. I didn't have anything in Mt. Gox. I didn't trust it. I've always been super like, not your keys, not your coins.
You got the memo about that early. It sounds like that was the whole raison d'etre for you.
That is the point.
Right.
But I also was hearing the rumors about Mt. Gox. So I was trying to short. It was the one and only time I've ever tried to short BTC. I was trying to short BTC at the time.
How did you short BTC?
I was taking loans. Yeah, I was borrowing. You
were borrowing Bitcoin.
I was borrowing Bitcoin. And I made a little bit of money, but not much. And the big lesson that I learned there was that crypto does not respond to fundamentals. Bitcoin does not respond to fundamentals.
Good luck then.
So that was another lesson.
Okay.
And then
Bitcoin's tested you.
Yeah.
Sufficiently, we hope. Yeah.
So then I started a company called Epiphyte. Epiphyte was basically, I figured that if we want to create sort of like a seamless experience where people are using BTC, then it needs to be in the background. They need to not even know that they're using BTC. And also I wanted to make sure that that other people, including myself, didn't lose their businesses in the future because they lost banking. And so with Epiphyte, what we did is, I think I actually made a big mistake. I think I was one of the first people who said blockchain, not Bitcoin.
Oh, man.
and the reason I did this was because I was trying to sell to banks. And we actually got 6 of the 10 largest banks, Sberbank, Barclays Bank, Santander, BBVA, Lloyd's, were all clients of Epiphyte early on. What we were doing is we were working on POCs to integrate into their back office. And I was saying to them, look, you don't need you don't need to understand Bitcoin. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to help you integrate. And today it's going to be BTC you'll be using as the settlement mechanism. But tomorrow maybe it's something else. I don't know. But I was trying to figure out a way to get in there, get BTC integrated between banks so that you could transfer funds between banks using BTC as a settlement mechanism.
Were they allergic to the word Bitcoin at that time? Or did
they were starting to? Yes, by 2013, 2014, people were very allergic to the term BTC, Bitcoin, and so you had to find some story to tell them.
So your story was blockchain, not Bitcoin at the time.
Yeah, we won the most prestigious sort of banking innovation award in the year 2014, the Swift banking innovation award.
That must have been right around the time when banks of any kind were starting to invest in blockchain technologies.
Yeah.
Right?
So there were companies that did it much better than we did it, because they basically were, screw Bitcoin, we're going to go full bore. We're going to just tell the banks that you don't even need to think about Bitcoin.
Right.
There was Digital Asset, raised hundreds of millions of dollars. There was another small project you may have heard of called Ripple. And so there was a whole bunch of projects out there who basically went and they sort of abandoned. They weren't saying, look, integrate Bitcoin now, figure out what you want to do with it later. They were saying, forget about Bitcoin. And they, for a while,
and that went well.
They raised a lot of money. But nothing ever happened with any of them.
They didn't work.
Yeah, but we didn't. We didn't raise a lot of money in the same way. And eventually we had to pivot to creating a real business. And what Epiphyte ended up becoming was one of the first remittance companies that used BTC. And that ended up, from a financial perspective, being a real stroke of luck, because 2016, 2017, we had a network where we had been set up. And we were transferring funds from primarily Europe, because I'd moved from the US to Europe because the regulations during the Obama administration and during that period was basically death to be doing anything. Like it was in the US. So, and also most of the big bank customers that were willing to work with us, probably the names that I mentioned, you also noticed they were not American banks. These were the large European, Australian, and other banks. So we moved to London. And so most of my customers ended up being remittance companies across Europe. And we were sending funds to Nigeria, to Thailand, to Brazil, to Zimbabwe, to...
What year was this? Was this like, are we edging towards the block size?
So now we're talking about 2016, 2017.
So yes.
And so what started happening is you started getting these divergences where Bitcoin would be trading at a premium in Nigeria, or a premium in Brazil, or a premium in, we never did Korea, but a premium in Korea.
Because you could only get them in certain like rails, basically.
Yeah, it was very, very difficult to get money in there to basically you could sell your Bitcoin there, but you'd never be able to get the money out.
Right.
But we could get money in, right? Because what we were doing is we were buying Bitcoin for euros and then selling Bitcoin for Naira or Baht or whatever. And we were making big markups.
You were also getting a premium. You were just undercutting anyone else who could possibly...
Well, it got crazy. At some point, we would sometimes make as much as 20% on a transaction.
That's insane.
In remittance, it's unheard of.
Yeah.
And so what we built out this API where we started paying remittance companies to send their money through us. So instead of them paying us to move the money, we were paying them to let us move their money for them. And this business it was a fantastic business until Jamie Dimon and JPMorgan started through basically the back door cracking down on activity across the space. And almost all of our banks, their US dollar settling bank, clearing bank was JPM. And so I took my first vacation in years, got back home, 1 week vacation, got back home, and there was a letter.
You were debanked.
And then another letter, and then another letter. And we had been dropped from all of our banks in the same week.
Oh my gosh.
So,
I mean, do you even work in crypto if you haven't been debanked by JPMorgan? I mean, like, seriously, though. I mean, like, does anyone use Chase Bank in our industry for more than like 3 years without getting the letter?
It's less common now, I hope. But yeah,
I've gotten the letter.
I mean, look, we've also just had Choke Point 2.0, but the reality is it's actually Choke Point 5.0 or 6.0. Like this Operation Choke Point has been an ongoing problem for the... Look, also BXIL, my whole business was about trying to help Bitcoin companies route around the banking system.
Right. Okay, so you get debanked, and this is what, like now we're like fully in the block size wars era.
No, just to highlight how sort of ironic this was. We were the first. We had won the prestigious banking awards. We had the largest banks in the world as our customers. We had helped create. In many ways, I think it's not an exaggeration to say I was the architect of the very first sort of safe harbor thing that ever existed, which was in the UK, the FCA created a program where we called it the sandbox, and I helped to a great extent create what the sandbox became, and we were the first company through the sandbox door. So we had the FCA, we had the regulators working with us, the big banks working with us. We were working with legitimate regulated players. We were, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter. It did not matter.
Yeah. Well, to your point, right? This is the whole reason Bitcoin exists to begin with, right? Is that these banks just have too much control and can basically cut off anyone they want for any reason.
Yeah.
Okay. So after you get debanked, what happens? Like, what's the...
It took some time to reflect.
Okay.
And
up until this point, it sounds like your story, you were mostly working with institutions. Like you were mostly doing that game.
I couldn't figure out... I didn't want to do mining. I thought it was boring.
Kind of is.
I didn't want to have an exchange.
Okay.
Because I thought it was grift, basically.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. In what way?
Well, First of all, because it was basically coming to people and saying, look, that Bitcoin that you got, give it to me. And then also, once I'm holding it, I'm going to try and convince you to sell it for something.
Okay.
And then whatever I tell you to sell it, whatever, basically I need you to be actively engaged in buying and selling. And the reality is that traders lose money. They just do. 90% of traders will lose money.
Fair enough.
And
I've learned that the hard way.
Pretty much everyone I know who's made money has made money through high conviction, high patience.
Just hodling to death.
Hodling Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Not only Bitcoin, but mostly Bitcoin. But once the best is Bitcoin. I have a complicated relationship with shitcoinery. I believe tokens are amazing. I am an amazing primitive that can be really great for the world, but I think that mostly we've used it as just this ongoing scam that has lasted for 12 years now.
What is the use case of tokens, in your opinion, other than gambling?
A lot of things. So I'll start with the simplest. Our society is based on the ability for people to innovate and the allocation of resources towards innovation. We have a huge amount of resource misallocation. And the reason is because the ability to raise capital is very much a little club right now.
I'm with you.
And the law explicitly says that if you're not wealthy, you don't get to play. Right?
It's ridiculous, yeah.
So I don't like that.
The concept of an accredited investor is something that you're like not on board with.
But that's just like one small part of a broader problem around
like capital
the
formation.
very idea of equity. Look, there's a lot of Bitcoiners who will say, fuck, I hate shitcoins. But they go and create their own shitcoin, and it's a worse kind of shitcoin. And it's a Delaware corporation, right? And they're handing out these tokens, which they call shares.
Mm-hmm.
And those shares, instead of being secured by Bitcoin,
mm-hmm.
right, are secured by the full faith and backing of the courts of Delaware, right? And I want there to be I'm an agorist. I want there to be a freer market that everyone can participate in. So one really good thing that you can do with tokens is you can replace equity.
Yeah, replace basically like the security system.
The whole fucking thing about securities, I don't believe there's such a thing as securities.
I mean, I'm with you.
I believe they're insecurities, but not securities.
But I'm with you. I mean, I think that this is something that like we don't talk about, right? There's so much concern about, being labeled a security and what that means from a regulation standpoint that we don't really spend enough time probably as a community criticizing the very concept, right?
Yeah.
And like the idea that like this distinction should not exist and it's sort of like a form of state control that is probably bad for people.
Yeah. But let me take it one step further. A token is a really exciting and interesting idea. It's a very interesting primitive because what a token is it's a set of rights, which instead of that set of rights, it's a set of access rights or it's a set of permissions, which instead of being sort of extremely complex, you abstract them into a simple token. So for example,
that's transferable freely.
It's transferable, but let's say you want to do commerce. Like, let's say I want to trade with someone, I don't know, in East Asia. The way business works today is I'll usually need to figure out, okay, we need a contract, and we need to figure out, okay, this contract is going to be governed under the laws of a third country, governed under the laws of the courts of London, and if under this circumstance, you're going to need to do arbitration, and here's how we're going to do payments. It gets very, very manual and complex. But with a token, I can say, look, here's a service I've created. Here's a token which gives you access to the service, and that's it. That's the whole thing. It is a very powerful economic token, a very powerful economic primitive, which we hardly use in that way today, although not entirely not. If you actually look at what has sort of emerged in the crypto space outside of Bitcoin, there are a lot of really interesting examples of tokens being used in that way. And then the third thing about tokens is you can wrap not just rights, but you can sort of repackage particular properties or property rights. So, for example, what is a stablecoin? well, not USD or even USDT, right? But MakerDAO and DAI. These are new ways of sort of packaging. Like I want, instead of to have my ETH packaged as ETH, I want to package it in a more stable way so I can repackage it basically as this DAI token. These are very, very cool tools. And we're only starting to scratch the surface of what they really can do, because so much of it up until now is like, for the last few months, it's all been, these meme coins and Trump coin. And
well, speaking of, I have to ask then, do you think that there is like a unique benefit or disadvantage, as the case may be, to tokens on Bitcoin, aka Bitcoin native tokens?
Yes, I do. But let me, before I explain what it is, let me explain what I think is the problem.
Okay.
So, 1492, Columbus discovers America. Columbus, a lot of people have complaints about him, but there's a lot to admire about Columbus. And I think he didn't come with the intention of basically wiping out the populations of 2 entire continents, but that's what happened. And the reason it's what happened is because Europeans, for the first time, Europeans who had, suffered through the diseases of Asia, Africa, and Europe, suddenly encountered a population completely naive to all of these diseases, and it just wiped them out. They had no immune system. Well, we've been living under this highly regulated, authoritarian, fiat-based system for so long that our population is completely naive to free markets and has no immune system. And so what we've been experiencing over the last 12 years is really basically Satoshi sailed over here and with him a whole bunch of grifters like conquistadors, and we're just catching their diseases. So I think as long as that continues, it doesn't really matter where the token is.
Although to be fair, and this is I think the key question when people talk about free markets and whether or not they really work, when the stock market started back whenever it was, late 19th century, et cetera, you also had just this mass wave of grifters, and that led ultimately to the Depression and all of these things. And this is why we now have securities regulation.
It led to the Depression. I think that's not.
You don't think that's accurate?
No, I don't.
Because that is definitely the party line, right? Is that it was the lack of regulation that ultimately led to.
I think probably a lot of people today would say that the 2 best sort of explanations around why the Great Depression happened were written by Milton Friedman and weirdly Ben Bernanke. So if you want to get 2 separate views on why it happened, but neither of them think it was grift.
What were their 2? I mean, do you have the TLDR on their 2 points of view?
Yeah, basically, both of them think it had to do with the Fed. That the Fed monetary policy is what drove that. It was not being responsive enough to the changing circumstances.
At that time, though, the Fed was theoretically tracking gold, right? Theoretically.
Not really, no.
Okay, so lots of paper dollars, basically, you think is the real cause of.
No, it was a lack of paper dollars, probably.
Okay.
So it's weird, right? We tend to think the problem with central banks is that they will print too much money. But that is one potential problem. The other potential problem is that they won't print enough.
Are you of that mind? How does that, what are the implications of that for Bitcoin and its hard cap?
Basically, they created a deflationary... Look, I'm not an expert on this particular subject.
Okay.
The primary argument is that they created a deflationary spiral. But why did the deflationary spiral occur in the first place? It's because instead of having a market system which can respond to changing market dynamics, you have a central organization which is trying to direct the market. And they couldn't figure out the right way to direct the market at that time. Now, I'll separate this and say, what is the alternative? Because most people haven't really considered the alternative. The most prosperous 2 periods in American history were free banking period, or sometimes called the Wildcat banking period. And in both cases, banks and companies were printing their own dollars. In fact, if you were in San Francisco, you would probably get Wells Fargo dollars. And if you...
That were not U.S. dollars.
Not
this
U.S.
was
dollars.
A completely
the government
separate
was not
value.
The dollars. And if you... it was backed by gold. But if you went to New York with that Wells Fargo dollar, you would get 93 cents on the dollar.
Huh.
And the reason is because you would need to go into Chase Bank, and Chase Manhattan,
they'd take a fee.
That was the most prosperous time from a productivity and GDP growth.
That was like the Industrial Revolution, basically.
Yeah, that was the Industrial Revolution. The best growing industrial economy ever was Scotland during the free banking system. There's really great literature out there studying the free banking system, and the free market actually given the opportunity to create its own money. Right? And this is also what Hayek said. For anyone who's into Austrian economics, right? Given the opportunity, the free market knows how to produce the optimum amount of money.
Okay.
Anyway, so the problem is the Fed is even worse than you think.
Okay. Basically, the Fed is even worse than you think. Okay. So this, we're back in 2017. You're reassessing your priorities and what you want to do with Bitcoin, and then what happens from there?
One big decision that I made is I don't want to do anything in the regulated space ever again. I don't want to have to wear a suit ever again. I don't want to have to ask for permission ever again. And also, from a first principles perspective, I think I'd been working on the wrong stuff. What I should be working on is trying to extend the programmability of Bitcoin itself.
Programmability.
Yes.
Specifically, the word programmability came to mind. You were like, let's make Bitcoin more expressive.
Well, look, this has already been a long-standing frustration for me. Even back into
talking about this at the time? Making Bitcoin programmable in 2017?
No. So in 2013, people were talking about it. I was extremely frustrated with the way, like, for example, exchanges, even the best exchanges, even like the ones that, I had good relationships with, like Kraken. You would go and you would send them your Bitcoin. Now, you could have not easily, but you could have created a scenario where you had a third-party custodian, you hold one key, the exchange holds a key, third-party custodian holds a key, and the Bitcoin does not sit.
It's a multi-sig.
Right.
Yeah.
We had that technology back in 2013.
It's good technology.
And no one was using it. And this ate me up inside. I hated it.
So people just weren't taking advantage of the tech that was available, is your point of
Yes.
view? Like there wasn't enough like understanding, educate. I mean, maybe I'm assuming that there wasn't enough education or understanding. What do you think?
I don't think it was an education and understanding thing. I think it was a market structure problem. It was not in the the exchange's interest to do this. And the vast majority of, and the weird thing is, right, the economic, because Bitcoin didn't have a native economy, the vast majority of the activity that we were seeing, right, which was economic activity, was trading. And the kind of people who are engaged in trading are not the kind of people who are interested in multi-sigs.
Yeah.
And so you had that was the problematic market dynamic. All right. So we had that problem. And so I thought what we needed to build out the tools to allow Bitcoin to have defense in depth, layers of decentralization around it in the application and services layer, not just relying on proof of work, right? But going beyond that.
So you kind of got like the DeFi bug, essentially.
Well, look, I had been deeply skeptical of the idea of stablecoins. But I thought that if stablecoins worked, it was going to be game over. If we could get decentralized stablecoins, it would be game over, because then you could have the ability to convert into a form of fiat-like spendable asset without having to go through a bank. And then 2016, 2017, Maker came out. And Maker was the first example of a fully collateralized, rather than sort of just some stupid algorithmic BitShares, later, Terra, the same mistake over and over again. What they had attempted to do, and did with a great deal of success, was take a asset, ETH, collateralize it, and create stable coins. And I had been sure it was going to fail. And it didn't. Now, later, actually...
So you were impressed?
I was deeply impressed.
Okay.
And I thought, this is very important. We need to be paying more attention to what's happening outside of Bitcoin. And so I started paying more attention.
So at that point, Ethereum was like kind of thriving already, but you were still in Bitcoin landia. But then after that, you thought, okay, these people are onto something. This is not just shitcoinery. This is something else. There's actual real world things, utility, use cases, applications happening that matter.
Yes.
Okay. So then does that inspire you to go try to build something similar for Bitcoin?
Yeah, it took me a while.
Okay.
I was trying to figure out how. I started working on a stablecoin-like project on Ethereum initially. We didn't really launch it because I didn't think we had gotten it to the point that it was secure enough. Then later, another project launched, which did exactly the same thing. And it was called Curve and did extremely well. And I was like, things work different in Ethereum land. Like I would never have launched, I think what we had built was more secure, but I didn't like it enough.
Things do work differently in Ethereum land.
So I spent a little bit of time in the wilderness, basically, looking for trying to figure out, like, what can we do for Bitcoin? And then when the pandemic rolled around, I and a bunch of other people, mostly from the Bitcoin space, we started working on building a decentralized network to get masks to people, because production lines and trade was collapsing all over. There were massive shortages of a whole bunch of things, but especially masks. And so we set up this network,
like a decentralized supply network. Basically?
Yeah. People were printing masks. Yeah, we created this 3D printable mask where you could put in an N95 filter, and then we just needed to get N95 filters to people. And people were creating these 3D printed masks around the world.
Wow.
We called it Block 19. And we wanted to get more of it. So we wanted to take donations, and we wanted to give people, create sort of like an NFT kind of thing for every mask so that you would know what you had donated. We wanted to do it on Bitcoin. And so
you wanted the mask to be certified on Bitcoin, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, we were trying to figure out how you do this. Remember, this is long before ordinals existed. And so eventually we started working on a platform called Rootstock, which was a Bitcoin sidechain. And a few months later, a bunch of the developers came and showed me some work that they said, and they'd been so inspired by this project that they had gone and built a DEX for Bitcoin on Rootstock. And I provided a grant, and we started building that, and that eventually became Sovryn, which eventually became like the largest DeFi ecosystem for Bitcoin.
I was gonna say, so it's a DEX, but what were you trading exactly?
So you could trade BTC against Tether initially.
Okay.
There were a bunch of other tokens that were created, like there was this Bitcoin-backed stablecoin and its token, and there was the SOV token, and a whole bunch of, so like this, and actually it's turned into a very large ecosystem. There was billions of dollars being traded.
And this worked essentially, not to get too technical, but was effectively an EVM layer on top
EVM layer merge mined with Bitcoin using BTC through a good peg, but still a trusted peg, but using BTC as the native asset.
What at that time, what was the best a peg could do? I mean, what was the best we had?
It's very similar to what we have today.
Just a federated multisig.
Yeah.
Okay. So federated multisig into this execution layer, like EVM merge mine execution layer, essentially. Okay. And then, so you built the DEX. The DEX was Sovryn. This was your company?
So Sovryn eventually, first of all, it wasn't a company. We don't do companies.
We don't do companies.
Delaware does companies. We do. We don't name. Because we can't call it anything, because I call them businesses.
Businesses. Okay.
It was a business that earned money in BTC and paid dividends in BTC.
Okay.
In a fully decentralized manner. And still does, by the way. Still does, to this day.
This was a big success for you, though. I mean, this was something where you became a new person in the industry, I think, during this time, is my understanding.
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, Sovryn did extremely well.
Right.
It created an entirely new category.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first time that I had something I felt like I could use.
And it was the first time that we really even had serious attempts at programmability or DeFi that was in any kind of way, shape, or form, really connected to Bitcoin.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. And so who were the competitors that sort of initially came up during this time? I'm going to call this programmable Bitcoin era 1.
I think that probably the closest sort of competitor would be a project called Alex, which
Okay.
existed on Stacks.
Alex Labs, is it the
Yeah.
same? Okay. So they still exist. Okay. So that was the closest competitor. And Stacks at that time, would you call Stacks a competitor to Rootstock at that time?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So like similar. And they were coming up around, this was again, the same generation sort of around the same time.
Now, again, while competing, I think, the relationship between all of these projects is not primarily one of competition, and should be primarily one of, look, we've just discovered a whole new continent. We need to populate it.
Rising tides lift all boats, right? This is like, we're building the Bitcoin of the future.
Yeah.
So what were the challenges? What were like the places where you felt like you got stopped there or there were limitations? And then, what happens in the season 2?
The problem was infrastructure.
Let's get more specific.
So I don't think Rootstock was secure enough.
Because of the peg?
Because of the peg, because of the merge mining.
Okay. Because of the merge mining.
Merge mining isn't good enough in my mind. And I know there are people in the room listening to us right now maybe who will disagree with me. But
we'll talk to him next.
But merge mining is not good enough.
Merge mining is not good enough for security.
Yeah.
Because can you like elaborate on that? I mean, isn't that theoretically, if you get enough miners, merge mining?
No, because the theory is that if you get, even imagine you have 100% of the miners in a merge mine system mining both systems, the sidechain is less secure. And the reason the sidechain...
Does it need... Oh, so you're saying it's just always going to be less secure than Bitcoin?
It's always going to be less secure.
But that's everything is always going to be less than secure than Bitcoin, no?
Not necessarily. No, there are ways you can construct things where they get very, very close or potentially 100% of Bitcoin security.
Okay. So there were security checks. You were like, I want even more, like as close to Bitcoin security as you can possibly get.
Yes.
Okay.
But it wasn't just that. So there was it was the peg was the primary thing.
The peg was the biggest security problem.
The peg was the biggest security
problem. The bridge, essentially.
Also, it introduced a huge amount of user frictions. And
because specific to
onboarding
bridge?
and offboarding. So we built a relay which made onboarding and offboarding very, very fast. But when you're using a peg, right, there's a whole bunch of questions you have to ask yourself. And so Rootstock actually, I think, admirably, were very conservative about the security of their peg. And so, actually pegging anything would take up to 36 hours.
Oh, it was like multiple confirmations and making sure that everything's one-to-one and blah, blah, blah. Just being conservative takes time.
But also just generally speaking, we had to build out a lot of the infrastructure of the chain. Rootstock at the time when we started using it
that would be the case
for a wasteland.
For any L2 though.
Yes. So there was a lot that still needed to be done and could be improved a great deal.
There was room for improvement, substantial. Okay.
And early 2021, I became convinced that there was a new technology emerging, and we have Ethereum to thank for that, really, which is zero-knowledge proofs. And that this was going
Thank you, Ethereum.
Yeah. Zero-knowledge proofs weren't invented by Ethereum.
But we talked about them with Bitcoin back in the day, but Ethereum really did the test network.
Threw hundreds of millions of dollars at ZKPs.
To develop this technology,
right?
Yeah.
Imagine you're like this cryptographer, no one pays attention to you for 20 years, and then suddenly... Right,
hundreds of millions.
You're just swimming in more capital than you right? So there was suddenly thousands of PhDs who were working on this.
Yeah. Amazing.
Amazing. It massively accelerated.
So this piqued your interest. ZKP, the zero-knowledge proofs, became a new fascination of yours.
Yeah, because this is an extremely powerful form of cryptography. It does a lot of really, really cool things. But what it allows you to do fundamentally is it allows you to prove that something happened without having to reveal everything that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And what that allows you to do is potentially to... take, for example, computation that is happening off-chain and prove it to Bitcoin in such a way that it actually becomes executable on Bitcoin. So here...
And much, much, much closer to trustless, circling back, than a federated bridge.
Yes. In fact, depending on what the construction is, can be completely trustless, right? Can be completely Bitcoin. Maybe we'll get there. There's a whole bunch of trade-offs. We probably never get rid of all of the trade-offs, but you can, depending on what your use case is, you get to choose basically how close to Bitcoin you want to be.
And an infinitely large leap
Yeah.
Is a fair
No,
thing
it's
to
a
say.
quantum leap.
Quantum leap
Yeah.
in trust minimization.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're studying this,
So
and you have this DEX on Rootstock.
yeah, and so I saw what we were doing with Sovryn as basically the early innings of building out the application layer that ultimately we would truly be able to bring not just to Bitcoin's sidechain, but to, Bitcoin's sidechains. You can think of them as Bitcoin's best buddy. I wanted to bring it to Bitcoin itself. And that's basically been my mission for the last 4 or 5 years.
Okay, so what was obviously I'm leading this question and I know the answer, but what was the sort of moment or instance where you thought maybe this might actually be possible in Bitcoin now?
Okay, so the big thing was that I thought that the only way we do this is by getting a not necessarily hard fork, but a fork of Bitcoin.
A soft fork. You thought we needed a soft fork.
I thought we would need a new opcode. And that's basically what I thought all the way up till the end of 2023. And then we'd been working on a whole bunch of things. And then Robin Linus published the BitVM paper. And I had already had a different idea, which I actually discussed with Robin, around using a form of cryptography which was not mature enough called witness encryption to achieve a similar...
Before he published BitVM, you had discussed this with him. So you had been working on this publicly and talking to people about this for a long time.
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, it wasn't just me. Like, there were a bunch of people who were obsessed with this idea of what I call, and a lot of us, I think, called the Holy Grail problem. Right? Holy Grail problem is, can you allow Bitcoin to be used in an external execution environment?
Basically, like, can you have a trustless oracle?
Yes. Or trustless oracle, trustless bridging, trustless programmability.
Off-chain into on-chain.
Yes.
Okay.
And so anyway, BitVM paper gets published, and that was a holy shit moment, because
inventing moment,
because it was so close.
Not quite, but so close.
Not quite. There, even to this day, it's not quite. No one's actually building BitVM, but for a bunch of reasons.
Hot take.
No, so since then there's been a new version called BitVM 2, which people are building, which looks very different from BitVM 1. Anyway, it's confusing, but it introduced this new paradigm of how you think about it. It was as new and fresh as ordinals was, but with so much more potential. Okay? It was just an entirely new way of thinking about what you can do with Taproot. Really, Taproot was a phenomenally powerful sort of upgrade to Bitcoin.
Would you think it's fair to say that just like sort of Taproot introduced the ability to put, image data, JPEG data, whatever arbitrary data you want onto Bitcoin, it also introduced the idea of potentially using Bitcoin as a data availability layer for these L2s? Like, is that kind of where this is going? It's like, oh, we now have literal space to put math on Bitcoin.
I don't think it's actually space. I think it's the ability to build. So it's what Taproot did is it created these transaction trees that you could
Merkle trees.
Yeah. Well, Taproot trees. Anyway.
Taptrees.
Anyway.
But is it not Merkle trees? I don't even know.
Yeah, so
you should do that.
And so it introduced a great deal of flexibility around the types of data and the types of manipulations you could introduce around that data for Bitcoin. It didn't actually increase the amount of data you could add to Bitcoin at all.
Do you know why we originally introduced these Taptrees? Like, what was the original intention of these Taptrees? Like, why did
I don't think there was a specific singular intention.
Because it's like a pretty complex thing to introduce.
Yeah, but so. I think, look.
Was it Lightning? Maybe it was Lightning related?
I think a whole bunch of people had a whole bunch of different ideas and realized that this sort of allowed you to create a great deal of more flexibility around how you construct Bitcoin transactions, which potentially could allow us to do all kinds of things. And for years, nobody actually managed to really do anything with it. Like, it was very, very complicated, right? And so it's been taking us a lot of time to start eking out the benefits,
right?
Depending on what your position is.
Figuring out what you can do with the thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So BitVM was one of these.
Yeah.
major breakthroughs that we didn't anticipate when that upgrade was first
so
released.
BitVM was, okay, so you get the BitVM model, introduces an entirely new paradigm, and we started working. So I had, made a few grants and contributions to a bunch of developers. We had a team of developers. We made a grant to Robin through the Zero Sync Foundation. And so I just been involved in trying to figure this problem out. And so we started thinking very, very seriously around what the implications of the BitVM paper was. And by late 2023, we were convinced that this was doable, that it was doable to build a system which would allow for ZK verification of Bitcoin, no fork needed. We published a paper on it in April, and then we demonstrated it for the first time in July. That was 2024. And it's not actually doing the entire verification on Bitcoin, although we did write a ZK verifier into TapScript, which is kind of insane.
And just for clarity, the particular type of proof that you were verifying was a snark, which is really like optimized for bridging specifically.
So that's, so it had, some kind. So specifically, we're actually using Groth 16, which is a particular kind of snark, but the system is much more flexible than just using
this particular type of snark. Though the core goal of it for you was bridging into a programmable execution environment with like the most highest degree of trust minimization back into Bitcoin. That was the goal.
Initially, I thought that what we were going to do is build a rollup on Bitcoin. And we would have the trustless bridging, and we would have the rollup use Bitcoin as its consensus and security and settlement layer. That was what I initially thought we were going to do. But something interesting and weird happened, which is that suddenly a huge amount of projects started saying that they were going to be building rollups.
Yeah, everyone now is like, everyone has a rollup. My grandmother is building a rollup,
and so then it occurred to us that potentially the value that we could bring is much greater than just building a rollup. It could be building a more general purpose tool, which would allow anyone who wanted to basically become a layer 2. And then after we demonstrated ZK verification with Bitcoin in July, something even crazier happened, which is a whole bunch of totally not Bitcoin projects, major layer 1 projects, started reaching out to us and saying, does this mean we can be a Bitcoin layer 2 also?
Yeah. Can we use your really, really super duper highly trust minimized bridge to plug into Bitcoin and do whatever we can do with Bitcoin?
Yeah.
It's my favorite thing about what you're doing.
And then sort of, there's the line, with the food comes the appetite. Our ambitions, our appetite grew. What we're now trying to do is build an operating system for all of crypto, which basically turns all of crypto into, for the last 10 years or more, there's been this distinction between Bitcoin and crypto. And what we want to do is basically bring everything home to Bitcoin. And we think that this is good for everyone. It's definitely good for Bitcoin. It's definitely good for Bitcoiners because we give them a great deal more value to their Bitcoin and a great deal more that they can do with Bitcoin without having to give up the one property that really matters, which is that it's yours, right? Self-sovereignty, not your keys, not your coins.
You can do anything with Bitcoin in a sovereign way is sort of the core.
Yeah. Now, look, there are trust assumptions that you're going to have to make.
But they're way better than they ever have been by like a quantum.
Way better than they've ever been. And we can keep improving them. Like we actually, since then, have come up with so many ideas for additional improvements. I think we might be at a juncture point that we'd never need to introduce forks to Bitcoin for new functionality ever. The one big exception to that might be quantum security. But in terms of being able to emulate covenants, to be able to do programmability on Bitcoin, to do...
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, all of that, I believe we have a path through clever use of cryptography to achieve all of those things.
There's so many directions I could take this conversation from here in terms of just like actually like looking at this technology and like the pros and cons and the challenges and advantages, et cetera. But in the sake of time, we'll keep it minimal. I would say like the most important question that I want to ask you about this is just like, what does this mean in terms of what the future actually really looks like? So we were joking last night that, OpCat, which is, another solution that maybe we'll get into a little bit that offers a similar value prop to BitVM in a bit of a different way through the soft fork path. We were joking last night, or I was joking last night with friends that we were with, that OpCat is bullish for Solana in the sense of like, it enables, right? Once you have this bridge, essentially the sort of like magic bridge, you can turn any of these execution environments into Bitcoin L2s. You sort of alluded to that. If that's the case, like, what does that look like? Do we see the Solanas and the Cardanos of the world becoming the place where everyone is moving around their Bitcoin? Or are we using these more kind of traditional Bitcoin L2s that everyone's building right now, rollup wise? Like, how do you see that all playing out?
Okay, I've got a lot to say on that.
Okay. I was going to say, I don't want to be late for your keynote.
All right.
But maybe we'll do a part.
Can I start with a little short history lesson?
Sure.
All right. I believe that the last 10 years have been a complete fiasco in terms of this industry's understanding of itself or what it's trying to achieve.
Okay.
Just as an example of this, we call it the blockchain industry. Nobody wants a blockchain. Literally no one. It would be as if gold miners called their industry the digging holes in the ground industry.
It's so true. Yeah.
And so it represents a fundamental misunderstanding of what it is that we're trying to build, which is an industry of ownership, verifiable ownership, verifiable transactions, and verifiable compute. Now, I'll come back to that in a second. But here's the history lesson.
Okay.
Right? 2012, 13, a whole bunch of people, including a guy called Vitalik, are working on things like colored coins, counterparty, Omni, a whole bunch of efforts to try and do what everyone realizes, which is to bring verifiable compute to Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And introduce to Bitcoin other kinds of assets so that Bitcoin can just be a general purpose ledger. That was the term we were using, was ledger, wasn't blockchain.
General purpose ledger. Okay.
Right? Vitalik loses patience. He's 19. Of course he loses patience. And so what he goes and he says is something very, very smart. He says there's another way we can do verifiable compute. And what it is we're going to take the entire piece of software, the whole computer, machine, the whole computer, and we're going to shove it into a blockchain. And then Bitcoiners are like standing there and saying, you're going to do what? And he's like, yes, we're going to shove everything into a blockchain. And then the way we're going to do the verification is that you do a tiny little compute, like every transaction is some computation.
Right.
Everyone in the world is going to run that computation. And so they call it the world computer, but it's actually the whole world trying to do everyone else's computations in parallel, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000.
Which sounds highly inefficient. Just like the way that you're describing, you're like, this is a disaster.
This does not scale. People said then that it would not scale. People say now that it does not scale. It does not scale.
Doesn't scale.
It does not scale. All right. But we got a lot of cool shit out of it. We got MakerDAO. We got stablecoins. We got DeFi. We got ZK verification. It was a 10 years of grift and development and innovation and excitement.
Gold nuggets. With some very serious gold nuggets.
Absolutely. Okay. But the whole point was, so how do we get verifiable compute? And because the way you made money was you created a token, which was like an altcoin for some blockchain, it became the blockchain industry. And today we've got more blockchains than there are people living in Iceland.
The real reason why we have this just like total like market dysregulation is because investors basically can take advantage of the lack of regulation of these token-like securities, right? Basically, instead of participating in the real regulated economy.
I think that's part of the story. I think a lot of the VCs and everyone really have been getting higher on their own supply, which is, if you ask these VCs, what are they investing in? They're investing in crypto and blockchain, right? This is what they think they're investing in. Right? They're not.
But they're actually just like buying tokens that they can liquidate earlier than they would if they did actual venture capital with real companies.
Yeah, and they've invested in some things which have created real value for humanity.
That's true.
All right.
That's true. But
the
there's
world is
so much
complicated.
grift. There's so much grift because there's just misaligned incentive.
Because we don't understand what we're doing, misaligned incentives, and we have no immune system for a free market. All right.
Okay, circling back. That's a good touch point back.
There you go.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So now, why is ZK so interesting? Because it gives us a way that you can do verifiable compute where you run the computation once or a small number of times. You create a proof. You write that proof to a ledger, right? And then that ledger is a universal ledger and settlement system for all of that compute.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you still need external compute environments. You still need to run the computation somewhere.
Right, you can't do that on Bitcoin.
So Solana might be a place that you run that.
Mm-hmm.
But when Activision Blizzard launch a game, they could just launch it on their own servers and make the entire game verifiable.
Fair point. Right. So it's not like, oh, this is so bullish for Solana or the L1s. It's like any execution environment in the world ever could be an L2.
Yes.
Verifiably. This is the theory. And this is really what Boss is bringing. This is the vision of Boss.
This is a Bitcoin operating system, right? Bitcoin becomes an operating system for verifiable ownership, already does it. Verifiable transactions, already does it, but only for BTC. Now we can do that we are bringing programmable tokens to Bitcoin so that Bitcoin becomes a general purpose ledger, right? Not a blockchain, a ledger, right? And we can now do verifiable compute so you can build trustless services, trustless applications, and start doing things like identity, like gaming, like AI, all kinds of things that the throughput requirements would go beyond any blockchain that will ever exist, and use Bitcoin as a central coordination point for all of it.
And so this is the key distinction between you potentially and your peer group in Bitcoin Season 2, is this distinction between an operating system, or the way that I've sort of come to think about that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is sort of this very, very, very sophisticated, near trustless communication, basically, between any execution environment and Bitcoin at all times, right? That is sort of a key distinction versus a rollup, where a rollup is by definition focused on one individual execution environment created by that project.
We're not competing with anyone in the space. What we want to do is work with everyone in the space to enhance and empower them to achieve what they're trying to achieve, which is to build systems which are truly built onto Bitcoin security. Now, maybe they don't have 100% Bitcoin security, but they're fundamentally built with Bitcoin as a place where transactions settle, where security occurs, and where the assets exist.
Which makes a lot of sense, because just when you think about in practice, every execution environment is going to be optimized for different kinds of things, right?
Yes.
For different kinds of use cases. The idea that one rollup can do everything just doesn't make sense. You need to have different execution environments for different kinds of applications, and to actually optimize them proficiently, and then just basically have the magical bridge, essentially, or operating system, as the term might be.
So, yeah, but I'm trying to get away from the word bridge, because I think people have a very, very specific idea of what a bridge is, which is a bridge is you're moving assets from one place to another, which is not necessarily what we're talking about.
Right. People think it means multi-sig, even if it... Yeah.
No, but even forgetting that, bridging doesn't necessarily mean moving an asset from one place to another.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. I agree.
So
people think that. People think you have to send your Bitcoin somewhere.
So let me offer a different metaphor.
Okay.
Right? We've got today the Internet of Information.
Mm-hmm.
We just call it the Internet. The Internet of Information allows you to transfer information from node A to node B, routing it through maybe a whole bunch of other nodes, right? And it does this using TCP/IP, right? You're sending these information packets, this IP, right? IP packets from one place to another. An Internet of Value would allow you to have different nodes coordinating amongst themselves to transfer or manipulate value together. And the way that that's going to be done is it's going to be done through proofs, through verifiable compute. And so the Internet of Value is going to see proof passing, right? In the same way that the Internet sees IP packets moving around. We're going to see ZK packets moving around, and they're going to move between Solana and Bitcoin and a centralized server, which is an exchange, but non-custodial because you don't need custodial anything anymore, and games and AI agents, and these AI agents interacting with each other. This is where we're going. This is what we want to do.
It's like the energy. It's like the chi of the system. It like, like I was going to say, like lifeblood, right? Like it's the blood that runs the system.
And so the result is, I don't think these chains, Ethereum, Solana, I don't think they go away. If you look at the internet today, the 8th most popular website to this day is Yahoo.
What?
Yes.
I don't even know what that is.
Exactly.
Is that a blockchain thing?
No, Yahoo. Yahoo.
Oh, Yahoo. Oh. Okay.
You know that thing that your mom's got an email?
Okay, no. I
know, mommy@yahoo.com?
Okay. Not the chocolate milk. Yeah, okay.
So Yahoo is still the 8th most popular website in the world.
Fair.
All right.
Interesting.
So Ethereum, 10 years from,
right.
10 years from now,
legacy it
crypto looks completely different.
Right.
It's completely unchained.
Right.
The chain is not, no one will be talking about L1, L2. Because
maybe Solana will own meme coins forever. Who knows?
It's possible. Exactly.
That'll be their brand.
No,
you know,
exactly,
they'll be like the Kleenex of meme coin trading.
The Gen Z traders today.
Yeah.
Right. They're going to be the boomers of tomorrow, still trading their stupid little meme coins.
Solana.
Mom, again with the meme coin.
Oh my God, that's so true. Yeah, the boomers of tomorrow will still use Solana. That's a good quote. Oh my gosh, this was so fun. We need to do a second episode so that we can talk a little bit more about sort of like the details of, I mean, not to get too nerdy. I know you don't love that, but like, you know.
No, I'm happy to get nerdy.
The details of sort of like how you guys are using BitVM and Snarks in a little bit of a different way than other people, although I think that this is my favorite part of the conversation. It's just so the modular component of what you're doing. I love it. I'm obsessed with it. You know that. And it just makes a lot of sense to me versus building an execution environment that's just like one thing. It's just,
Not that there isn't value there. I think one point that I sort of have made and have had to make peace with myself is that even in a pile of dirt, you'll sometimes find a diamond.
Fair.
And so, we get very upset as maxis around all of this stuff that's happening, but it has generated really interesting value if you know to look for it.
Totally fair. I'm with you. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the rollup people, it's a very it's a laudable goal, right? The rollup people, the data availability on Bitcoin people. I mean, you got to love it. Cool. Okay. Well, we also didn't get to talk about Opcat, which is something I really wanted to dig into with you, because most people who come on my podcast just are like, yep, we love Opcat. We're opcode upgraders, progressive opcode people. And I think you have a slightly different point of view potentially. So I'm curious to get your take, but we'll have to save that for another episode.
All right. Well, it looks like we're going to have to do this
Part 2, you guys. It's coming.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.